All right, this is the second video in this little journey of trying to implement some automated code building or automated app building through this approach that I'm calling, or that I've heard called, intent-driven development. So this is the second video. I will try to figure out how to link to the first video. If you haven't seen that, this probably won't make a ton of sense unless you see that first video. So today we're going to be talking about the second bot. So let me start out by just sharing this drawing, my little map showing you where we are. So this was the flow that I thought we would be doing yesterday. And in particular, yesterday we talked about this. That's the wrong tool. Control Z. We talked about doing this section, and we demoed that yesterday. We implemented specifically the intent agent. And just a quick recap, the way this is planning on working is we want a person over here, this person right here, to be a non-technical person. This is the project manager, the PM, product owner, could be a stakeholder, somebody like that. We want them to provide an intent into the intent agent. And then the intent agent is currently taking that intent, documenting it, creating a spec file, and then particularly the most important thing it's doing now is it's creating a series of acceptance criterias for that intent. And those acceptance criteria are written in a GWT format into the spec file. So that's where we got to yesterday. All right. Then today I started working on this again. And the idea was, all right, well, once we have a spec with some intent in it and some acceptance criteria, we ought to be able to start writing tests and code. Or at least kicking it down to some new agents, right? So particularly, I started focusing on the architect agent. So this is the agent that's going to take the acceptance criteria and make it into code, ultimately set it up so that it can be made into code. Now, this is proving to be pretty difficult. The main reason why it's difficult is because I only want user interaction up here. After the intent has been written into acceptance criteria, if I can execute this in an ideal world, and I don't know if it's possible, all of the rest of this should cascade down in the background and just happen. And I know that feels kind of magical. It is kind of magical. But that is the goal. All right, so what that really means is this bot is kind of been difficult to write. I've been going back and forth on this, taking some iterations on this, because it has to be perfect. It has to execute without user interaction. So how do we handle that? Well, after some thinking, I've decided to redo the workflow a little bit. So it's a little bit more complicated. I don't know, maybe not more complicated. I've got more details figured out. All right, so let's start over here. This is still the same. The project manager provides an intent to the intent agent. Over here, you can see next what happens is the intent agent writes the acceptance criteria into the spec. That's a new file. Because it's a square, it's an artifact. So that's a markdown file in our current implementation. Then that should kick off the architect agent. And you can see right here, this is what we're going to be focusing on today, is this section right here. Messed that up. Let me try it again. We're going to be focusing on this section right here. The architect agent is going to read the acceptance criteria. It's going to process that acceptance criteria, and it's going to determine the domain IO. That is the line in the sand that I've decided to draw. That is the requirement that I have established for this architect agent. It needs to write domain IO back into the spec. Domain input and output. All right. So what does that actually mean? So at this point, we are going to start getting into details that are very specific to our code base. So hopefully this will still be useful for you if you're using different approaches. Hopefully you can still use this as an idea. But the reason why we're doing domain IO, the reason we have to agree upon a few things. Because the next few steps over here, we need to get queued up to be able to deliver something to a domain agent here. And that domain agent is going to write out domain code right here. All right, that's one step that's going to happen. The other thing that's going to happen is we got a domain testing agent here. This is the agent that's going to say, all right, this is what was expected. I need to write tests that prove that happens, particularly on the domain. And I'll talk about the domain in a second here. The next thing that needs to happen is we're going to have a view agent. This is the agent the agent that has been designed to write our front end, to write our React code in our example. And they're going to be able to write once they know, all right, once they know the domain IO, I'm thinking they'll be able to do that. I do have one more block up here that's a little poorly defined. I do want end-to-end testing at the end of all of this, but we'll get back to that. All right, so what do I mean by domain agent, domain testing, and the view agent? Well, this is going to get into our particular architecture. So let me go up here. I drew up a little picture of our architecture and how we generically, abstractly, I don't know, how we design our apps. And we do this very specifically. I have a very strong opinion on how this particular app and web app, or this style of app that we're building is called a slide app. This is a plugin that's going to be working inside of our player and inside of the VLP. And we have a very opinionated architecture. This architecture is based on domain-driven development, and it's also influenced a lot by Uncle Bob Martin, his clean code architecture. So let's get into that a little bit because this is important. And I would encourage, I actually think a strong opinionated structure may be required for this thing to work. I don't know. I don't know how much you can let the bots just run free without structure. Maybe they don't need structure. My experience has been bots need structure. And if you can explain the structure to them, you're going to get results. Also, we do want to keep a little bit of handle on this. I don't want a completely vibe-coded app at the end because I'm not confident that the agents will be able to do everything that we want them to do. I think the agents will be able to do simple stuff, and they might get more and more complicated over time. But we need to be prepared as developers. This is going to be software we're going to support over time. This is not a simple tutorial thing. This is production code that we will need to support and we will want to add features to in the long run. And so me and my guys, my developers, we're going to have to be able to dip into this code and read it and maybe manually get in there and fix things. Hopefully not, but I am not confident that we should bet that the bots are going to be perfect and they'll be able to do everything. I've seen a lot of friends, colleagues, do the vibe coding thing, and they're not necessarily coders. And what happens is they start out, things are great. Then something goes bad, and they have to. It borks the entire project, and they can't figure out what. We cannot afford to get into that position. So we're doing this kind of like controlled vibe coding in a way. And let me dive into how I'm going to hopefully control the vibe coding. And it really comes down to guardrails. All right, so let me get back into this. Let me get back into my drawing. So let's talk about the domain. So the domain, when I talk about the domain is the heart and the soul of the application. It is the business logic, it's the state, it's the, all of the stuff that your app does. In our example, we're doing a multiple choice question. So you can imagine there's going to be some like inputs for clicking on buttons. There's going to be places to store the question text, places to store themes. I don't know, all the stuff you're going to imagine for this app. That all lives in the domain. And the domain is strictly isolated from frameworks. All right? And what do I mean by frameworks? Frameworks are, in this example, is React. If you're using other things, frameworks are any sort of like system that you do not have control over. It is a tool you're using that someone else developed. That is a framework. Now, obviously, you can get really pedantic on this. I'm using TypeScript. Is TypeScript a framework? Okay. No, not in this example. But things like React, if you're using Vue, if you're using, I don't know what you're using, but whatever you're using that, it's a framework, right? We often do. We're not doing it in this engine or in this app. We often will do 3D stuff, 3D scenes and stuff like that. Game, kind of more like 3D game stuff. And so we choose to use Babylon.js for our 3D engine, but you could also use Three.js, or you could also use Unity. You can use a command line. All of that stuff that is kind of like the layer that faces your user, that's framework. So going back to our drawing, we are very, very careful. Oops, I just messed up. Hold on a second. We are very, very careful about isolating the framework from the domain. What that really means is if we decide that we're going to start out rendering this in React, and then later we're like, no, let's render this in, pick your other language. Let's render it in raw HTML. That is a framework decision. The domain should be untouched if you do that, if you make that decision, right? The underlying logic and functionality of multiple choice should exist. Should be untouched by the decision on how you present that to the user. So that's what I mean by frameworks and the isolation between our domain and our frameworks. This particular app is also a plugin. Like I said, it's a slide app that we're building for our environment, our player environment, our VLP environment. And so it does have this external host. And that is outside of the domain. All right. So one of the main reasons, let's talk about the inputs and outputs real quick. So we talked about down here, this guy's job is to write domain IO. That is the thing we want to write. So when I talk about domain IO, we've got domain in. We've got two ways that events come in to our domain. Right here, a framework, React, a button in React, calls a controller, right? This word controller is very specifically defined in our architecture documents. This is a very special word. It's not a loose word. We have a very specific and concrete definition of a controller, what a controller is, in our documentation, in our architecture. And that's important to have because this is a contract between a known domain and an unknown framework, right? This has to be very specific because the framework can switch, and we want to allow that. All right, so that's one input. The other input that can come in is a request. So we have established a communication protocol. It's very rigorously defined again between the host and the domain. And there's a known number of requests that a host can send to the domain. And it's because so the host is responsible for things like maintaining the state, and progressing through the activity and turning this particular app on and off, providing the desired state to the app, managing the authoring state, stuff like that. That's all host responsibility. And the host can trigger the domain by posting a request to it, by dispatching a request to it. So that's another input. So notice there's two inputs to our domain. Nice and simple, very clean. That means down here, this architect agent, when it's reviewing the acceptance criteria, it just needs to identify, is this event triggering through a user's interaction, and that would be a controller right here, or is this an event an event that's being triggered by something coming from the host? All right, that is what needs to happen down there. Now let's talk about outputs. So that is the input to the domain. Regardless of how the event hits the domain, there are two ways this can cause. There are two output paths for this. We'll talk about the request going back to the host first. So the domain, just like the host can dispatch a request to the domain can dispatch a request back to the host. Now, again, these requests that are established, these requests are established. There's a list of requests that the domain can send back to the host. And these requests are, this could be example like go to the next slide, because the domain doesn't know it. This app doesn't know anything about the slideshow. It knows it's inside of a slideshow, but it doesn't know the next slide. The host is responsible for all of that. If we need to record a score, that is the responsibility of the host. And so that is the domain posting a request to the host. So that is output. The other output from the domain is a view model, can be delivered to the framework via an adapter. Now, this is hopefully you might have to go Google. This is a presentation manager view model pattern that we're doing here. But essentially what happens is the domain has decided, the framework, let's just be very specific. The framework is React in this example. And when React needs to update a view, a presentation to the end user, it should be handed a view model that this is an immutable object, that a view that is sent out of the domain, and the domain is just like, all right, this is something I want you to display, and the framework should display that. All right? So, without getting too much more deep into that, the reason why this is so powerful and how we're going to put the guardrails on this is because these inputs and outputs around the domain, we can write tests for this, right? So when an integration, when the agent, the architect here decides, all right, for this use case, for this acceptance criteria, I am going to call this function. That'll be this input right here. We're going to call this controller, and this request should be sent. That is a testable feature, right? That is what we're calling domain integration test. We're not caring about what is going on inside the domain. This is where the kind of the vibe coding is going to happen in a way, right? Inside the domain. We don't care what happens, but we're going to have a test that says, all right, if I call this controller with this property, this request should be coming out. Or, let me clean this up a little bit. If I call this controller with this property, this view model should be emitted from the domain. That is testable. And those tests are going to be associated with acceptance criteria. All right? If you're a domain developer, or if you're a test-driven developer like I am, big fan of test-driven development. The way we do test-driven development is you write a source file, and right next to it, you write a test file, usually jest or vite test, right? That is going away. That used to live inside the domain. Now we're going to have a test file, at least one test file, maybe multiple test files, associated with an acceptance criteria. And that test is going to live in the folder next to that spec file. Now notice what we've done here is we have isolated testing from development. And I think my gut, this is my opinion, is that this is critical if you're going to use AI agents to code. You want one agent that writes code, and that agent should not be allowed to touch tests. And you want a different agent that's writing tests, and that agent is not allowed to touch code. This is your checks and balances. These are your guardrails, right? And then once they both agree, once those tests are written and they pass, I think we're going to be pretty. I think that's a good sign. So over time, so imagine now, we're going to have an intent file, an intent folder. Actually, let me bring this up. Let's show the app. So here in the app, you're going to have, where's my window at? Here in the app, oh, I lost my window. Hold on a second. Let me come back to, let's get to here. There we go. Here in the app, we're going to have folders with intents in them, right? Now this intent, actually, let me undo these changes real quick. Not important right now. These intents are the spec files. Okay. And in this spec file, we have acceptance criteria. So we have set the stage, right? This is the intent. The acceptance criteria for this intent are these, is this, and this, and this. So if these are true, then we can say this intent has been implemented. We can say this intent is good to go. So we want to get to the point where we can automate that check. So there will be a file, a test file or more associated with each acceptance criteria that will run every time we build this thing, right? And that means in the future, when we've added, 500 specs, this first spec that is still alive will still have its test files next to it. And we will still be checking to make sure this passes. So if that bot jumps in here and starts getting all vibe codey on the domain here, let me come up here, and starts breaking stuff, old specs, we will know and we'll catch that. That's the goal. That's the guardrail I'm trying to implement. And I kind of think that's going to be critical for this. I do believe that's critical. I think as we roll more and more into AI, as a developer, as we roll more and more into AI coding, my job, my goal is to find ways to leverage bots, because why not? That is a tool. That's like, I don't know. It's obviously here. And if I am not using AI bots to write code, I'm falling behind. But my job now is to assure quality code. So there's studies out, you can go look these up, that show that AI development is producing tons and tons of code. Output's going up, quality's going down. The good news is you and me, developers, we can control quality. We can check quality. But our job is now becoming more and more about putting the tools in place, organizing our process so that we check quality. We're becoming QA people, quality assurance. All right. Anyways, let's get to it. Okay. Where were we? Enough ranting and raving. Let's see. Where are we? Okay. Let's get back to it. Let me go back to my drawing. So again, we're down here. We're focused on this step right here. We have got the first steps done. Can we achieve this? So I have written this architect agent. Now, I wanted to take a few minutes and describe the process that I'm using to write this architect agent, because I've kind of come across, I've kind of developed, or I don't know, through lots of failures, I have come up with a flow or a process that I find works pretty good for creating these agents, or at least getting them off the ground. In the previous video, I showed you how I tuned an agent. I think I did that. But let me show you how I instantiate that agent. So what I do, and this is a little interesting. I'm sure I'm not the only one doing this, but I've started doing this. Let me flip to a different, not that one. Nope, sorry. Let's go to, nope. Sorry, I'm gonna get it to the right code window. Let's try this one. No. Oh, struggling here. I apologize. Let me get back to, here it is. Here it is. All right. So this is my process for creating an agent. This is a VS Code project, obviously, that has no code in it. All it has is Markdown files. And I have gotten to really enjoy writing my documents in Markdown in VS Code, because I have access to Copilot here and I can keep track of stuff over here. So this is where I have been creating it's kind of my notebook for this intent-driven development. It's where I'm writing. I'm trying to write Substacks articles, and so it allows me to like create my Substacks and also keep my notes as I'm writing this along. So here is what I did. I knew that I was going to be handed a spec, an acceptance criteria, and I could look them up. We generated these yesterday with our intent management, our intent agent, right? And I just sat here and I thought through, what would I actually do? What would I do? I mean, I do this. This is my job. This is what I've been doing. My stakeholders, they tell me an intent. I take that intent. I turn it into some acceptance criteria. And then I usually bust that down into cards for my team. So what is my process? This was the goal. So I sat here and I wrote through what I would do. I start by identifying the inputs, and I wrote this whole thing out. And this was my journey. This is my user journey and the different ways it can go. Then I took that and let me show you the prompt. Oh, that was just it. I lost it. Essentially, I took this document and I asked the bot. I said, can you read about this agent and turn it into instructions for me? And it wrote out this. So it took my story that I was doing here, my verbose story, and it wrote the instructions out for an architect agent. Then I copied that over to my other project. Let me jump to that one. So this is my now back to the multiple choice app, and I threw it into here. And then I tweaked it. I ran through a couple times. Okay, so that's how I generated this AI agent. And again, let me just be clear, showing you what we're talking about. This is right here. This is this one we're working on. All right, so now let's jump back into the app. Okay, let's run it. Let's see what happens. All right, so let me start a new context. So let me show you where we're at right now. Yesterday, we used our intent agent to write these 3 intents right here. Side note, just a quick side note, I did change up a few small formatting patterns in my intent spec. Yesterday, I think we had some different to-dos in here. I had an empty spot for tests and tasks. That is all changed. I refactored that. The acceptance criteria is exactly the same. The only thing that has changed, the main thing that has changed is I have my intent agent create this to-do right here. And this is because, if you remember, jumping back to the drawing here, what we're hoping that this step is like triggered. Like it's not a manual trigger. I'm hoping to get to the point where after the intent agent has written something, it can kick off the architect agent. I don't have that in place yet, but that is what this flag is set up for. This is going to be a flag for the next agent, my architect agent, to know, oh, I need to do an architect review on it. And when it's done, it's going to check this off. Okay, let's go ahead and kick this off. Now, remember, we are trying to, I am manually triggering this, but I want to design this thing to be without user input. So I am going to point it towards my architect agent, and I'm not going to give it much prompt. I have to give it a little bit of a prompt to get my send button to go. But I'm just going to say review this. All right. And I have given it, let's give it spec 1. All right. Now you can imagine we could automate that. Now there should be no interaction between me and this bot after we kick this off. So I'm going to go ahead and just kick it off. And then we're going to talk about what is it going to do. What it should do is it should review this spec. It should look for all the acceptance criteria that need an architect review. When it sees these architect reviews, it's going to add a new section underneath this bot for domain input and domain output. And it should specify what kind of input, what kind of output, and whether or not it's new or not. All right. Now, the tricky thing about this is this bot really needs to understand. I'm going to switch over to this while this thing is cooking and we'll come back to it. It really needs to understand what we're talking about with domain, with request, with the different outputs. And that's proven to be the trickiest part of this thing. So it's taken me many, many iterations on this bot to get close. Well, I mean, it started out decent, but I had to keep on adding details to this thing, adding documents. And let me show you my approach to documentation. This thing is working. And we'll come back to this, but we'll come back to this. The way I've been doing my documentation is I have a folder called documentation here. It's a bunch of markdown files. And as I come across concepts, let's talk about host app communication. This is describing what's going on right here. This is the host app communication. Describing that, I have a markdown file where I wrote all of that out, where I wrote down all the details about this stuff. Furthermore, I wrote out more details about the app dispatchers. So that is, where's my switcher? That is the app dispatchers. That is this section right here. So when the app wants to dispatch something, I have a whole nother markdown talking about that. And I have another markdown that talks about all the host requests that we can receive. So that is describing, whoops, hold on a second. That is describing what can happen here. And I had to keep adding the details to this as we went. Now let me jump back here. I probably have to do this. Here we go. Okay. Then what I did, so I did that a bunch of ways. So here's our app dispatcher. Here's our core principles. Here's our host app communication request. These are all the details on how we serialize the state, working with the host on this stuff. Here's a few definitions. Here's our slide app lifecycle. All of that, right? Then what I did was I created this markdown called the knowledge lookup. And what I did was I told the bot to review all of my markdown files, put them in here, and create kind of like an index with keywords. So if the bot is thinking about component system patterns or app object or entity, it knows it needs to go read this markdown. If the bot is considering set is authoring, then it should go read this markdown. I don't know how well this is working. It seems to be working pretty well. This is an approach I'm trying out. This is how I'm going to continue to add knowledge to this thing. The other thing these markdowns do is they allow me to jump right in here and in my agent instructions, point right to it. So like this is my agent. And when we're defining the domain input, if it is a host request, I point it right to that documentation. So it can read about that. I'm having pretty good luck with that. Now, the thing we're struggling with, the thing I'm trying to be careful about is your context window. If you guys know about LLMs and your models, you'll know about context windows. And what you gotta tread this, you gotta walk this line of working with a bot. If you give it too much context, it's gonna get lost. It's gonna drift. It's bad. If you don't give it enough context, it's also bad. It's gonna make up stuff. So this is my attempt at trying to allow the bot to populate its context window by using keywords and lookups. I don't know if it's going to work. We'll see. All right, let's get back to it. This intent has been completed. Let's jump in and take a look at this thing. So what it should do, and it looks like it did. I'm going to go ahead and keep it just so I can read it easier. All right, so this is the first intent, the spec file for the first intent. Here is the first acceptance criteria. Given a multiple choice question has been authored, when the user views the question text and all answer choices are displayed. All right, first off, let's take a look at our to-do list. If you remember, this was unchecked and it was the only thing in the to-do list. Now the architect review has been marked as complete. And these have been added to the to-do list. You can see we have some to-dos. This is queuing us up for the next bots we're going to be building. The domain developer bot, the domain integration test bot, and the view bot, right? That relates to these bots that we've been talking about down here. This bot, and this bot. These are now queued up to get going. All right, but we'll do that tomorrow maybe. All right, so now we've also added a domain input. All right, set app state. This is great. This is a host request. So you can see it's being told to use, to deserialize. Okay, so you can see, I won't get too deep into the weeds on this thing, but this is correct. The host should send a state. This is the input. A serialized state, a serialized state that has the question, because the question has been authored. The user is viewing the question, so we're going to have the question in a serialized state. That's going to need to be dispatched to the domain. And then the output of this is an adapter. This is great. This is not a dispatch back. And it defines what it needs to see. This is the view model that should be passed to the view so that the view can display the question text, the choices, some sort of state, and is interactive. I'm not sure what that means. I'm going to let it do its thing, though. Cool. That's great. Now let's look at the next acceptance criteria. Again, the to-dos have been updated. All right, this has got a controller input. This is a domain input. So wait, let me read the acceptance criteria. Given the user is viewing a multiple choice question, when the user selects an answer choice, that choice is visually marked as selected. So you can see the user, the action is the user selects. So now we can see it's a controller. It's a new controller. And this is what it looks like. Select answer. User ID is going to get passed in the app object repo. Perfect. Outputs. The adapter is going to be updated. Perfect. We're using the same adapters up here. Okay. Next. What are we at? Wait. Here we go. Given that the user has selected an answer choice, the selection is recorded. The feedback is immediately displayed whether or not the answer was correct or incorrect. Okay. So was the answer right or not? So again, we have a select answer, same input as up here, same controller. That makes sense. And again, same output, except it's just saying updates with state to correct or incorrect and is interactive to false. Okay, great. Given the user has selected an answer, when the feedback is displayed, the user cannot change their selection. Again, we're using the same inputs and a PM output. Perfect. So this is good enough. I think this is good enough. And just take a moment here to notice we have now identified the adapter we're going to be using for output. What does it look like? As well as the input controller and a state from a state being passed in through our host dispatcher. That should be enough information for this domain agent. Oh man, I got too many scribbles on here. Let me clean it up a little bit. We now have enough information for this domain agent to implement the domain code. We know it's going to get this input and it's going to need to create this output. We also have enough information for the domain testing agent to start writing the integration tests to prove that each one of these acceptance criteria is responding as defined. All right. We also have enough information for the Vue, for the React agent, to start implementing the front end. It can now say, all right, I need a button, or I need to display this text when I get this. I need these to be interactive. I have this button to click on, and this is what I'll call when I click that. And here's the text to display. All of that is ready to go. So I think we're tuned up and queued up for the next iteration, which will be the next bots. So, all right, guys, gals, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that was useful. I'll probably see you tomorrow. I don't know. I'm going to continue this on. The next agent we're going to be building is the domain code, the domain developer. Don't really know what that entails yet, but that is the next step. All right, that's all I got. Keep on clicking.